We're going to run a pretty tight schedule. So welcome everyone who has joined so far. We're 25 attendees, and I feel like more are going to come in. So my name is Aaron, and I am a Global Citizenship, Education, and Activism Support Officer here at Friends of the Earth. You're all very welcome to this webinar on fighting fossil fuel influence in politics, in media, in advertising. So just to give a tiny bit of context about the project, and then I'm going to hand over to some of our speakers, and then there'll be time for Q&A after that. So this is part of the Learning Hub series of activities. So the Learning Hub are a reading, learning, interacting mode of participatory education that we run in Friends of the Earth, which is funded very generously by Irish Aid. So I'd like to acknowledge their support. And the goal of this project is for people to come together, to think, to learn in a community, and to be able to take active participation in these issues and take action on these issues after the fact. And it's about bringing together these different perspectives and looking from local issues to global impacts and how these things connect together and systems of global injustice can be challenged. So you're all very, very welcome to this evening's webinar. Joining me on the webinar is my colleague from Friends of the Earth, Jerry McAvelli, Head of Policy at Friends of the Earth. He'll be giving a brief overview of our work on fossil fuel and gas campaigning. I'm also joined by Martine sorry, Martine, I'm going to have to ask you to say the name of your organization because my Dutch is awful.
Oh, good. Reclame fossilvrij or fossil-free advertising.
Thank you. Who will be talking about advertising of fossil fuels. Also joined by Hannah and Lounes from Stay Grounded, which is an anti-aviation industry umbrella campaigning organization. And I'm also joined by Laura from Purpose Disruptors and Clean Creatives, who will be talking about the advertising industry as well. Also joining me is Sarah. Sarah is one of our new additions to the movement building team, also focusing on global citizenship education and outreach. And Sarah will be helping with some of the tech and behind the scenes stuff. Do you want to maybe say hi, Sarah, and introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I've newly joined this team and it's been wonderful so far. I work in global citizenship education and outreach. So supporting all our different programs across the Irish Aid funded projects. And yeah, if there's any technical issues, you can just give me a message and I can try to help you out.
Brilliant. So I'm going to let the speakers talk for 10 to 15 minutes each. If you have any questions while the speakers are talking, there's a Q&A box in Zoom. You're very welcome to type your questions in there. We will be getting to Q&A at the very end after all speakers have spoken. And you can also, upvote other people's contributions if you think that a question is really interesting or relevant and you'd like to have it asked. So I think that's kind of it in terms of housekeeping. I suppose one more thing is that we have our feedback forms that it would be very, very appreciated if people could fill out. I'll be sharing those towards the end of the session after we've had a chance to hear everyone speak. And these are really useful for helping us run events like this and how we can improve and modify them in future so that they're best use to everyone. And then lastly, we are having a follow-on event from this next Monday at the same time from 7 to half 8. And that's going to be more of a participatory workshop format with some of our colleagues from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, looking at where next for this idea of having a global treaty around phasing out fossil fuels. What have the successes been in Ireland and where does the campaign go from there? So if you're able to attend that as well off the back of this webinar, you'd be very, very welcome to start kind of putting some of these ideas around fossil fuel influence and how we challenge it into practice. Okay, I think that's enough from me. So I am going to hand it over to Jerry to talk a little bit about the campaigning that we do in FO around fossil fuels and gas.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot, Aaron. I don't intend to use my full 10-minute slot because I'm actually more interested in what all the other speakers are going to say. There's also probably a fair chance you know maybe a little bit about what Friends of the Earth does in Ireland on the fossil fuel side. You may already be involved in it. I have to say it's a little bit disconcerting that we can't actually see your face. It's not a usual meeting. It's a bit strange sort of speaking to ourselves. But all I'm going to do is talk you through a little bit of the history and a little bit of our work, and that'll maybe bring us up to speed on the good work that we're interested in now, that Aaron's been talking about in terms of pushing back on fossil fuel influence. And it really is great to have people in the know involved in this and hear from them. So just to begin, where Friends of the Earth starts on this, as with many other groups and organizations, is we have to stop burning things. That's the fundamental response or measure needed to prevent the climate crisis or bring it to an end. We have to stop burning things. That's, that's as much necessary internationally in terms of what the likes of the IPCC has been telling us, as much as nationally in terms of what's required by climate legislation and carbon budgets in Ireland. And I guess where this mainly started from a campaigning perspective within Friends of the Earth is probably the guts of 10 years ago, which was, there have been opportunities to campaign on some really interesting initiatives around, for example, banning fracking in Ireland was one major campaign a few years ago, which was successful, as was removing the capability of Ireland's main state investment fund to invest in fossil fuels was another major campaigning win. And subsequent to that, there was another really significant development on the back of long-term campaigning, which was to prevent any further new licenses for exploration of oil and gas in Ireland, all through legislation. Some really positive developments, some somewhat positive developments as well, in the sense that we have a moratorium in Ireland on LNG, on liquefied natural gas. The fight lives on, is all I'd say in that space. There has been, still some very progressive steps, I would say, in the sense that the most likely LNG terminal in Ireland, planning permission was rejected for that, Shannon LNG. But maybe the common theme in all of that is that it's pushing back on new fossil fuel infrastructure. So Friends of the Earth's campaigning has been very much focused on what we call no new gas, or preventing further fossil fuels, with a particular focus on gas from being added to the system and preventing new fossil fuel infrastructure. And that's only one part of the fight. That's only one part of the story. There's also existing fossil fuel infrastructure, or existing fossil fuel use. And fossil fuels are everywhere across all sectors. And I'm particularly interested in the aviation side of things, because that isn't actually a current campaign. We don't have a current campaign in transport in Friends of the Earth, not for any good reason. We'd love to do more on it, but actually where we have been more active in terms of existing fossil fuels, not yet, but existing fossil fuels has been on the heating side and home heating, and really trying to promote and support the greater use of known solutions in terms of how we heat our homes. So that's the likes of retrofitting and the likes of solar panels on roofs and heat pumps and these types of things. And what's really, really crucial, and maybe, is an important theme throughout all of this, is that we have to bring a climate justice focus to all of this. So particularly in our home heating work, we've been talking about preventing fossil fuels. What does that mean? Getting boilers, or making sure new fossil fuel boilers aren't installed in homes. And of course, the first response in all of this is, how, for people who don't have the means, how is it possible for them, given that many of the solutions are not cheap currently? So it's about really focusing the solutions and the supports on those most in need. That's just to use one example of what is called our Warm Homes campaign. And now I'm coming to the end, and maybe I'll post in a link to our No New Gas campaign, just so you can learn a bit more about it for those of you who haven't heard it before. And also, so it's not only me speaking, but the last part of our campaigning is maybe the part that's least developed in some ways. So this is this issue of fossil fuel influence. And I would say how Friends of the Earth originally came into this issue is it's not enough when we respond, as we're responding or trying to combat the climate crisis, it's not enough to simply provide new technological solutions. We have to reduce demand. And that's a whole other conversation. But where the link is that we've been really looking at the industries that could potentially lock us in to more fossil fuel use. And in Friends of the Earth Ireland, it's particularly been around this question of data centers and the huge expanding number of data centers that are, if things go as they're projected, would require such significant volumes of additional energy, which would mean huge additional volumes of fossil fuel use as well. And that's what we've been particularly working on from a campaigning perspective. But we're hugely interested in learning more about how do we prevent the influence of fossil fuel industries or fossil fuel reliant industries as well. And I'm aware there's some really good work on this at EU level and in other EU member states around how, for example, fossil fuel lobbyists have access to politicians, or where they have access, or how they should not have access. That's one part of it. And another part of it is advertising, fossil fuel advertising and greenwashing. And that greenwashing question it's as relevant in, I would say, in the fossil fuel space from fossil fuel industries as in transport, as in agriculture, and in those industries which are particularly polluting. And long story short, this is the last thing I'll say, is that the context for us right now in Friends of the Earth from the campaigning perspective is all about the upcoming general election in Ireland. I say upcoming, we believe it's upcoming. We don't have a specific date yet, but that is when I'm listening to this conversation, I'm thinking, how can we influence politicians to make the right commitments in the upcoming general election? And I hope you'll listen in the same way, so you can also speak to your local politicians and even just use some of the same words with your local politicians. You don't have to remember everything. And maybe I'll pause there, Aaron. Is that all right?
Yep, that's perfect, Jerry. And I suppose if people have more questions about the nuts and bolts of our campaigning, they can stick it in the Q&A box. I will say I've seen some people raise their hands. We're not going to get to raised hands because we're going to be just talking to the panelists. But if you do have questions, put it in the Q&A box and we will be addressing them from there. So yeah, thanks for that, Jerry. And I think one thing you said there reminded me in particular about an action we did last year as part of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, where we were around the COP negotiations, where last year the highest number of fossil fuel lobbyists were present at COP compared to all previous iterations. And it was the first year that we actually got fossil fuels referenced in the text of COP and, a vague agreement towards a phase out. So people might remember we did an action outside Leinster House where we had people wear elephant masks and carry briefcases and jugs of oil and to address the elephant in the room of fossil fuels. So I think they, in many ways, fossil fuels still somewhat remain the elephant in the room when it comes to advertising, when it comes to greenwashing, and when it comes to the influence and decisions, the influence they have to politicians and political decisions that are made.
Aaron, I'll actually, because you said that, I'll get fired if I don't say this. But the reason people were wearing those masks, and we did that photo opportunity last year, was also because on the international side, we're also interested in pushing for support for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which is the international ask of all the international equivalent of all the domestic things that I was talking about. So we need a treaty to prevent new fossil fuels, phase out existing ones, and a just transition for those who are most affected. So now that I've said that, I'll let you speak.
I think that nicely sums it up, Jerry. Thanks, Emil. So first on our list of speakers for this evening is Martijn. So Martijn is based in the Netherlands and works with, again, I'm not going to say the name, but fossil-free advertising in the Netherlands. So I'm going to let her explain a little bit more about her work, what they've achieved, and what their focuses are.
Thank you so much. I put a timer at 15 minutes, but help me to remind if it's over. I'm going to share also some slides. with you. Yes. Do you all see it now correctly? Yeah, great. Yeah, so our organization Reclame Fossilvrij, or Fossil Free Advertising, is based in the Netherlands. And this is a photo of one of our first actions with our new team. We actually are with 7 people now. We are a super small organization that started from the fossil free movement in the Netherlands, with one campaign that became a national campaign and even an international campaign. And what we want is a world without fossil advertising. And in the Netherlands, we focus on a local law that bans, like a tobacco style law that bans all advertising from the fossil fuel industry. And internationally, we hope also that a fossil ad ban will be part of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and therefore we also work together with them. And we all work from, like, our perspective is always from health, because the tobacco law, hugely the push came from the health care community internationally and also in the Netherlands. And since a lot of people are like, if we're talking about health, we are really speaking to people's hearts more than if we're talking about our future. So if we explain that the fossil fuel industry is already killing our lives at this very moment, in the Netherlands, 12,000 people every year die because of air pollution, mainly coming from the fossil fuel industry. And if we and therefore we can, like, also work together with collectives of healthcare workers, of nurses, of doctors, of scientists, really explaining that our health will improve by phasing out fossil fuels. And you were also talking about, Jerry, about the demand side, and we really believe that a fossil ad ban is so much necessary to cut that demand side, because it's hugely influencing our collective behavior. And yeah, in the next 12 minutes, I will explain more about our campaign. But first, I'll take you back a little bit in the not back in the future, but back in the history. A guy that maybe we don't know yet, but he had a huge influence on the arising of the PR industry. And his name is Ivy Lee, and he was just born after oil was found. And in the beginning, when we found oil, we didn't really know, like, what to do with it. It was just like this useless thing that came up when we were digging for water. But then we found out that there was actually a massive amount of energy in that oil. But oil still needed to be sold to the world. And the PR industry did a really, really good job in, like, telling that we needed oil in our daily lives for everything. And Ivy Lee was one of these people that actually was on the in the beginning of this story, and he invented the press release as well. And by that time, he was working for the railroad companies, and huge accidents happened with the railroads because very often they were understaffed, underpaid. They didn't do their job really well, and when an accident happened, they just people were talking about the company in a bad way, and they asked Ivy Lee for help. And Ivy Lee said, hey, you should never put things in a box and don't talk about it. You should talk about what happens, but leave the truth in the middle. And if we tell the story first to the press, they never be able to talk about us. So by this, he actually invented the press release. And he said, words really matter. So in the beginning, they said, hey, something happens. We don't know yet what happened. We are still researching the cause of this accident. It could be something out of manufacturing of the train, something that the railroad was the only thing that the railroad was not responsible for. So then they left it in the middle. And actually, if confusion is your goal, then mixed messages are also fine. So maybe if people are talking about it in a different way, it's fine, because confusion is your goal. At least they're not pointing their finger to you that it was exactly you. And he also reframed then later on stories, because people were talking about, yes, but it's understaffed. And he started changing the words. So not talking about full crew, but talking about extra crew. Imagining that they already did a lot and even something extra to make sure that new accidents wouldn't happen. So he actually uses the truth to sell lies, because it was definitely the railroad companies that were responsible for these accidents. And these things actually we see a lot today in the fossil fuel industry, these strategies. And later on, he started working for the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers, they were the owners of a big coal mine. And in these mines in Colorado, also a lot of accidents happened. People were again underpaid, overworked, and they were all working in the coal mines. And they started organizing themselves and raising their voice against the coal mine owners, against the Rockefellers. And then Rockefeller shut down actually this protest with armed guards, and a lot of people were killed. And it goes into the history as the Ludlow Massacre. And then the Rockefellers, they went to Ivy League and they asked like, hey, can you help me? Because he was being seen as one of the most hated men in the US. And then Rockefeller, in only 20 years, Lee helped him to turn him from one of the most routinely hated men in the US to a kindly philanthropy. And still now we know Rockefeller as one of the philanthropists in the world. And he did that through a combination of tactics that has been used by everyone from dictators to CEOs ever since, and that is still very much being used by the fossil fuel industry today. And all these stories about Ivy Lee and a lot of other men who stood at who invented actually the PR machine. You can listen to it in the podcast. It's called Drilled, season 3 by Amy Westerveld. And it's really like a lot of information in there. And when I heard that story for the first time, I started looking very differently to advertising from the fossil fuel industry. Because it's not only these ads that influence our behavior, it's like a whole strategy behind it. And actually these stories and like the PR industry is why there could be such a climate denial for such a long time. In fact, the only reason they say that science denial worked is because it came on the heels of this 100-year propaganda campaign. And the fossil fuel industry helped to create the PR industry and the publicists, and it came up with this disinformation, its manipulation tactics, and they deployed for oil, tobacco, and the chemical companies for decades. And tobacco and big oil, they also used to work a lot together. So all in this podcast, I won't go too in depth. And then still a few decades ago, this image of this Marlboro man watching over children's schoolyards, especially targeting the very young ones to smoke, it was still very much an image that was super normalized. And because of a lot of healthcare workers and a lot of scientists and so many people that stood up and that organized themselves in the campaigns, we now cannot imagine this anymore. And yeah, with the fossil fuel or fossil advent campaign, we are a lot inspired by the anti-lobby against tobacco. So yeah, and therefore, from this health perspective, to campaign from this health perspective, we believe it's very powerful. And also, if you look to the US again, in 1917, one of the first measures against big tobacco was actually a ban on ads on radio and TV. And it took a very long time before it actually, like in a lot of countries, was banned. But this was one of the first things. And after that, there came room for other prevention measures. And we already saw, like from the very beginning, as soon as they became measures, also the rate of lung cancer dropped. So it's definitely not something that is going to save us all immediately, but it's really essential part of a whole bunch of measures. And that's something about our campaign, because our campaign started really small in The Hague. And every year in The Hague, a children's festival was organized by Shell. And at this children's festival, all the schools in the neighborhood were invited, and Shell was explaining to the very young generation that we're going to need natural gas to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, that they were very much focused on girls to inspire them to work in technology, and it got like a big subsidy from the Hague municipality. And we thought, okay, this is a real big greenwashing event and we should stop it. So first we were able to stop the subsidies of the festival. And then we were able to ban the entire festival. And by that time, we also we came to the understanding that the festival won a kind of a lobby prize. So a children's festival that wins a lobby prize. So it was not only an event to greenwash for the children and their parents, but it was definitely also for politicians. So a lot of politicians were invited there on stage. And yeah, it won a European lobby prize because this helped a lot to put Shell on the agenda as an immiscible, a company that couldn't be missed in the city and abroad. Yeah, so children's advertising is what we see a lot in the tobacco industry as well. And Shell and other big oil companies are using a lot of children advertising to give you a really nice feeling, especially already as a child. For example, these Lego, is that also an English word, Lego? And Lego toys, if you already get a super nice experience as a child with something that has the Shell logo, it's really difficult to change it into something negative later on. So this is all part of this big propaganda machine, and it's working really well. Then there's other parts of we distinguish different types of advertising. So lobby advertising is to put things on the political agenda, and that happens a lot. So for example, natural gas, as we now use it, liquid natural gas, which actually is fossil gas, but if you call it natural gas, it sounds something that is quite natural and something quite green. And it was definitely pushed forward on the European agenda by using a lot of advertising for it. So that definitely helped. And now it's actually EU policy that we need gas, which is like natural gas for our green transition until we can actually go into actual renewables. And we also did a court case against KLM. KLM is the biggest aviation company in the Netherlands, and also now partly from Air France. And we took them to court because of their misleading advertising, especially the fly responsibly advertising. So we used this court case to show actually that greenwashing even is already forbidden by law because you're not allowed to mislead, but we don't have a good system to tackle it. So before we went to the advertising watchdog over and over again to show advertising from KLM and mainly KLM and Shell to say hey, this is misleading. It's not in line with your policy. And then over and over again, the advertising watchdog told us, yes, you're right, it's misleading. But then the campaign is already over and the damage is already done. So you keep on being too late. So we thought, okay, let's do a big court case and really show for once and ever that this is misleading. And so we also have jurisprudence for later court cases. So yeah, we won this court case against KLM. They're not allowed to do this advertising anymore. It's really difficult to tell them that they cannot advertise at all anymore. So they will keep on going most likely with well, they do it already. They keep on going with greenwashing advertising. But for example, they cannot use sustainable aviation fuel, which is not sustainable at all, SAF. The court also ruled that this term on itself is misleading. So they have to use another term for it. They're not doing it yet. Then we also focus on advertising in newspapers. So very often you see this advertising, it looks like a newspaper article, but it's actually branded content. So that as a reader, you think, I'm going to read an interesting news article, but it's actually paid by, in this case, Tata Steel, the biggest polluter in the Netherlands, the big steel company. And yeah, these things, we try to find first movers also in newspapers to say, hey, we want to stop this. We don't want to facilitate this greenwashing anymore. And we Trouw, that's one of the newspapers, they want to do it. They didn't do it yet because there's always this big companies above them that don't allow them to. But they want to stop also advertising, fossil advertising in their newspapers. yeah, then also you should really watch out that sometimes companies are advertising even though they don't sell anything. So this is RWE, this is a German company, and they took the Dutch government to court kind of this court for the Energy Charter Treaty. And then during that time, they massively started doing advertising. Well, RWE is not a company that sells anything, so it's very specifically lobby advertising. Yeah, so overall, this is our strategy with the with the fossil-free movement. We want to dismantle all the support pillars of the fossil fuel industry, and advertising and media and sponsorship is a very big pillar, we believe, from the fossil fuel industry. So we focus on all these things at the same time. And we believe that if we do dismantle the support pillars of society from the fossil fuel industry, we will dismantle the fossil fuel industry itself. Yeah, and we do that in our little organization by creating first movers. So we have now wins in 13 cities that passed a motion on a fossil ad ban. So cities can make a local law that bans all the advertising in the public spaces. And now 13 cities said, hey, we want this. And they're finding now ways to make this local law. And next week, I think we will hear from the city of The Hague if they're going to be the first city that actually creates this local law. Then museums, they have a lot of sponsorships from fossil fuel industry, and we were able to cut a few of these sponsorships. Then we have one colleague who is focusing with his team on fossil-free football. There's a lot of food sponsorships also in football from the fossil fuel industry. Then the newspapers and also the cinemas, especially the art house cinemas, where there's a bit more left-wing people going. More than the general cinemas, they're also in favor of this, and we're also targeting them. And then we have a lot of research that's backing our campaign. Recently, our Minister of Climate and Economy, the previous one, before he stopped, he asked 15 behavior scientists to do research on the effect of fossil ad ban on collective behavior, and the outcome was really good. They said fossil ad ban is essential. It should be part of this bigger package, but it's essential. Without it, we are not going to succeed in this transition. And then the IPCC and UNEP also have some research, and TNO is a local governmental research institute. Also some amazing research. So it's backed enough by research, and we're using the law as well. Because also we are now living in a country where we have an extreme right government. So we do gonna need our court in order to make climate policy move faster than the parliament is gonna do. And all of this, like everything that's happening around the world with fossil ad ban, you can find on a website, World Without Fossil Ads, and you find all the wins there, all the research that's been done. The research from behavioral scientists will be translated soon into English, so now we only have it in Dutch. But yeah, I can send all these things also to Aaron to later on spread around. Yeah, I think it was a few minutes too long, but that was it. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Martine. That was great. Yeah, so if there's any questions, put them in the chat and we'll come to them at the end. One thing that I noticed there that reminded me of Ireland was the shell kids toy thing, because we have a very prominent art competition here in Ireland, the Texaco art competition, which is funded obviously by a pretty big producer of oil. So similar tactics across the world. Okay, great. My next speaker is Hannah from Stay Grounded. So Stay Grounded is a cross-country campaign that aims for a just transition of the aviation industry. So Hannah is going to talk a little bit about the influence that the aviation industry wields in terms of advertising, but also in terms of political influence and sort of the demand from the industry side to increase passenger caps, numbers of flights, et cetera, et cetera. So Hannah, do you want to take us away then?
Cool, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen as well, so just give me 1 second. Okay, great. Hopefully everyone, that's worked okay. So yeah, I am from Stay Grounded. We are an international network, over 200 member organisations, and we essentially campaign for the degrowth of aviation, so for a massive reduction in air traffic. And we come from this, or to this, from a climate justice perspective. So aviation itself is obviously a cornerstone, or one of the cornerstones of the fossil fuel society that we live under, and aviation is really the kind of pinnacle of the climate injustice of that. So obviously flying is one of the most polluting modes of transport, or is the most polluting mode of transport, but it is also one of the most unequal. So only 20% of the world's population have actually ever flown. So 80% of the world's population have never set foot on a flight, and only 1% of the world's population cause 50% of commercial aviation emissions. So people often, when we talk to people, if I ever do interviews, people often say, well, you can't just stop people flying. And the thing is really, well, who is flying? The majority of the world's population is not flying, and so we're always approaching it from this perspective, and also we're always approaching the reduction from the perspective of making it fair. So the measures that we campaign for and the way that we approach it is always about how can we fairly reduce aviation. This is another example of the climate injustice and the fact that one flight can be more than some people's whole footprint across a year. Obviously things like private jets, the most kind of polluting of aviation, are the kind of pinnacle within this, but aviation itself is obviously hugely damaging. So in terms of the kind of structural way that the aviation industry operates, it operates much in the same way that we see with the fossil fuel industry in terms of its tactics. And it has these different kind of pillars, one of which being aviation lobbying. So in the same way that we see fossil fuel giants lobbying through trade organizations and individually to policymakers to combat and water down environmental regulations, we see the aviation industry doing the same. So these are two very big aviation trade associations, the IATA and Airlines for Europe. And these really operate to prevent policymakers, or to really like combat the environmental regulations that policymakers try to bring in. So on a kind of public level, we see the aviation industry committing to net zero, trying to greenwash the public by presenting itself as on board with climate measures. And this took place in 2021, where the IATA committed to this net zero pathway. At the same time, receiving huge bailouts during the COVID pandemic, taking huge amounts of public money, all while, you've probably read in the papers, sacking huge numbers of their staff and having absolutely terrible workers' rights. And then behind the scenes, lobbying against environmental regulation. So whether it's trying to get to water down this prospect from the EU of monitoring non-CO2 emissions, which are a huge percentage of aviation's overall emissions and are not currently covered, and are not often even spoken about, and generally not quoted in terms of the kind of global figure for aviation's emissions. So this is all happening behind the scenes, all while, of course, they are greenwashing. Interesting that we both have this same advert, and really great that Martina's already covered the kind of case behind it. So we see this trying to present flying as a kind of green thing, no longer just an aspirational thing, but something that you can do while still being environmentally responsible. And we also see them presenting this narrative time and time again that airports are good for the economy, so that local communities really benefit from airports, that workers really benefit from airports, and that expansion plans are therefore net positive for everybody, and that anything that counters that, any reduction in flights, would have an inevitable knock-on effect to all these things. This has been disproven, as this article shows, and also obviously doesn't come with any of the kind of analysis of a just transition and what the future looks like for aviation workers, and of course doesn't take into account any of the health problems and the disruption that is caused to local communities who are on a huge scale campaigning against a lot of these expansion plans, and obviously doesn't include the environment at all. So we as a network campaign for demand reduction because it is the only way that we can stay within planetary boundaries within the issue of aviation, and all these solutions put forward by the industry do not work and are not real solutions, essentially. But the industry, as discussed, lobbies against any kind of measures that would effectively and fairly reduce demand, and instead really put its energy into carbon offsetting, because offsetting essentially allows them to continue doing what they do, continue with their growth plans, whilst saying, okay, we'll buy up huge portions of forests, generally forests, but also other projects, in order to kind of justify their continued emissions growth. Often these projects are in the global south, and it often takes a lot of land away from communities that are already using it in a much more efficient way, and obviously it's incredibly unfair. But thanks to a lot of campaigning, thanks to articles like this one, there has been a lot of work on carbon offsets, and we're starting to see this as an argument that the industry can no longer use. It's been really successfully discredited, to the point where I think it was United Airlines, the boss even himself said, the CEO even said that they're fraudulent and discredited them further. This doesn't mean to say that they're not still a powerful greenwashing tactic, but it does mean that the industry has now moved on to this so-called SAF line, which is so-called sustainable aviation fuel. And there are a number of issues with it. It is a kind of broad umbrella term used by the industry for a range of different fuel alternatives, be it biofuels, be it waste-based fuels, be it hydrogen, electric. The problem is with any of these forms of fuels, they're just not scalable at the level at which we currently fly. So the industry is trying to present them as such, but they are not something that would ever be sustainable. And this is some photos from a action week that we recently held, where across Europe, over 30 different cities took place, repurposing advertising billboards to make the point against greenwashing and highlight the kind of greenwash that's usually around us in our cities every day. And this is a recent win that came off the back of it. It was a complaint that we put in about Luton Airport, which was trying to expand and present its expansion as green. We put in a complaint to the UK Advertising Standards Regulator, and they recently banned it, which was really great and shows that these kind of things are effective ways of highlighting this and also getting some news traction. And the other structural issue that we see is this kind of direct and indirect web of subsidies that you see the aviation industry benefiting from, which is why we get flights that are £17 for where the train would cost you 100, because they are largely exempt from tax, and they benefit from both tax exemptions and also subsidies. So whereas you pay fuel tax on the kerosene in your car, tax on the fuel in your car, you don't pay tax on kerosene across the EU, essentially. I'm just going to skip through this slide because I am aware of time. But this is essentially the kind of tax gap in Ireland. So if it was taxed correctly, this is the amount of money that the state would be getting from the industry that it is currently losing out on. And it's a huge amount, and something that's projected to go up by 25% by 2025 if these things are not addressed. And I just wanted to quickly touch on Schiphol Airport because it has become a bit of a test case, and it is something that the aviation industry is obviously looking towards. This is a quote from Willie Walsh, the head of the one of the biggest trade associations, and they're obviously using Schiphol as a kind of example in which they want to show to other airports that caps are not something to be pursued. So there's been campaigning from a number of our members around Schiphol for decades. We're currently at a situation where we're awaiting another verdict. And there have been some wins along the way. There have also been some drawbacks. And there's been a series of different appeals, all related to the amount of, amounting to capping the number of flights that take off from Schiphol. But I think it's a really interesting case because I think it also highlights a lot of the kind of a lot of the learnings that we have within the network. As a network, we exist to unite different campaign groups and basically unite the global struggle. So groups who are campaigning against different airlines or on different aspects of the aviation industry can share skills, can share knowledge, can connect, and they can, in the same way that the aviation industry has the same MO and works together, we can kind of combat this by uniting people and sharing the skills and the learnings that we have. So we're going to have some more information coming out soon about the Schiphol Airport case and the learnings from it that you'll be able to find through the Stay Grounded channels. And this will kind of, share some of the reflections from the campaign itself. I think I am at time, so I will hand over, but I can also share some more resources at the end and other ways that you can get involved in the network.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hannah. And yes, there's been a few requests for resources from various things participants have mentioned. So we are going to be compiling a list of resources that we're sending out to participants of the webinar to read, watch, listen back on. So don't worry if you didn't catch something, it will be sent to you afterwards. And also I'd just like to take this opportunity, thanks Hannah for that, to mention that there is a group in Ireland that's after getting started that is aiming to campaign against the expansion of Dublin Airport. So it's calling itself Children's Rights Over Flights. So I've been involved in my Friends of the Earth capacity in supporting some of what they've been doing. I'm just going to share their social media here in the comments. And I'll also be sending that out after as part of the resources. But they're having a proper launch on the 10th of August with a kite flying event on Dollymount Strand. So people will be more than welcome to that if they're in and around Dublin. And I think also, one thing that is quite relevant is that Ryanair is our biggest polluter in terms of emissions in Ireland. And I think we've seen in the last few weeks how they've been directly kind of interfering in Irish politics in many ways, not even quietly lobbying, but they've held like actual demonstrations when Eamon Ryan stepped back as Minister for Transport with placards that their workers were holding saying less bikes, more flights. So they are very obviously trying to generate, a consensus and a kind of anti-environmental backlash to justify things like the expansion of Dublin Airport and further routes for them for the benefit of, their shareholders and people like Michael O'Leary. So I think that's worth commenting on as well, that they are a very prominent fossil fuel corporation that we actually have in Ireland that maybe some people don't really conceive of in that way, but they very much are. Okay, lastly, I'm going to invite Laura to speak. So Laura works with Purpose Disruptors and Clean Creatives, both of which are kind of professional organizations made up of professionals working in the advertising industry, looking at combating greenwashing and fossil fuel influence, so sort of from the inside. And I think Laura's going to talk a little bit more about the Irish context and how the Purpose Disruptors and Clean Creatives do their work here.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everyone. It's been so nice to just sit and listen to all this brilliant work and the passion behind it all. I'm going to share my screen as well. Hopefully, see if I can enter into. Can you see that okay? Is that working? Super. Yeah, so I'm coming from the inside. I work in a marketing agency here in Ireland called Pink House. So we're an independent youth marketing agency, I guess, with a vision for a world of brand and businesses that people, young people and people generally actually want. And we're a B Corp if you follow that movement at all. But yeah, I'm here in the capacity of, I guess, the Ireland lead for Purpose Disruptors, and also an ambassador for Clean Creatives. And I used this photo of me as a kid with a sunflower recently, and I want to keep doing it because it just helps ground me in the why are we doing this work in the first place? It's because of love, and it's because of awe, and it's because of all of these things that we share in terms of community and passion for the world that we're in. So I kind of just like to remind myself and start there. But really, I guess this journey starts with realizing, working in marketing and advertising, that if we're good at our jobs, if I was really good at my job, I wasn't really helping. I was actually doing the opposite of helping. And that journey started about, 5 years ago, and meeting a lot of people in the industry who were like-minded in terms of, working in strategy, not necessarily always with fossil fuel clients, but generally in the business of driving growth, no matter kind of what the objective was on the page. And I guess the story is now that, there's a lot of people outside and inside the industry talking about this, which is brilliant. You have people like advertising and like ad-free cities, like talking about, the need for advertising to stop working with fossil fuels, but also to kind of, I guess, to use creativity in new ways as well. And Purpose Disruptors and Clean Creatives, I guess Clean Creatives, it's sat here outside the industry, but there are a lot of people within the industry who see themselves as advocates and ambassadors for Clean Creative, saying, we want other agencies to follow suit and pledge to not work with fossil fuel. And then inside the industry, again, like it's groups like Purpose Disruptors who are building communities of people who want to use their creativity in new ways. And I guess it's worth noting, obviously, like the positive impact that, activism plays in terms of, I guess, accelerating these conversations, and it being really focused on marketing, advertising, and public relations. It does drive conversation. So obviously this letter back in 2019 led to a lot of action around, the biggest award ceremonies in the industry that got people talking. But I guess before I go into a lot of detail in terms of the work that's been done, just a little step back. So Purpose Disruptors, and what is it? So really the mission is all around catalyzing the ad industry's climate transition. And the vision is very much for the marketing, advertising, and media industries to be transformed in service of a thriving future. And I love that vision because every time I read it, you're like, well, surely all our work should be in service of a thriving future. And obviously, currently it's not. So we're working to bridge, I guess, that sense of competition across the industry to actually build collaboration across this issue, and reshape our industry to tackle climate change. So there's 3 pillars of work that's underpinned in terms of, what this community building and this kind of vision of regenerative leadership and regenerative creativity could look like. But the 3 main pillars are education through an alliance called Change the Brief Alliance, measurement, advertised emissions, which I'll speak a little bit about later, and Good Life 2030, which is all around creativity, which I'll also speak a bit about. But Clean Creatives is, as again, another movement that's growing in the ad and PR industry, but it's all around bringing together leading agencies, staff, and clients to really address the climate crisis by declining future contracts with fossil fuel companies and their front groups. And basically what it's about is putting guardrails for engagement with energy companies to ensure, you know, that we're not greenwashing and that we are just not engaging with companies that are obstructing climate transition. So, I mean, this is a very single-minded, I guess, campaign. It's about getting companies to not work with getting creative companies to not work with fossil fuel companies. And there's loads you can research in terms of, you know, who is currently working with fossil fuel companies. There's actually a brilliant resource that Clean Creatives have online called the F list, and it lists all the marketing and advertising and PR companies that are currently working with fossil fuel clients. There's over 1,100 agencies that have signed up and 2,000 individual creatives that have signed up to not work with fossil fuel clients. And it's also, you know, not just about the pledges, but about the conversation that's driving then as the movement grows, that people are kind of making it, you know, that there is no social license to operate, you know, that's becoming less and less in agency land as more people join this. And really the reason it exists is because the storytelling has such power. You know, every misleading story starts with an agency that's working with a fossil fuel industry. So really the comms industry is an essential part of this disinformation machine, as we've spoken about already. And I'm sure a lot of people here saw the UN Secretary General talk about this recently, you know, talking directly to agencies to stop taking on new fossil fuel clients and set out plans to drop your existing ones. And I guess, you know, touching on the public relations kind of side of it, saying like, this is toxic for your brand, like tapping into that reputation piece, and talking about employees and creative people already mobilizing around this. So how we can actually accelerate that is really exciting. And obviously, you know the money that's being invested here, there's billions and billions being spent on fossil fuel advertisements. And we talked a little bit earlier about, you know, the different ways that fossil fuel advertising is coming to show itself today. But it's really interesting to look back on some of the early days, you know, and the story so far. Like this one, every time I see this, I'm just absolutely blown away. You know, an ad. So this is obviously, you know, Humble Us, which was previously, which is now ExxonMobil, bragging about being able to melt glaciers back in the 60s. So, you know, we've come a long way, but you can just see, I guess, that story of how creativity works to normalize the industry in the first place. And then obviously a lot of people know this story as well, but BP kind of popularizing the term carbon footprint in order to kind of shift responsibility or focus away from itself onto individuals. There's obviously, you know, doubt, denial. There's that phrase, you know, delay is the new denial as well. But, you know, so we're a little bit past this denial piece, but at the same time, it is still a reality that these kind of ads get made. Obviously, we're seeing a lot more delay tactics nowadays in terms of, you know, talking about gas a lot more, talking about renewable fossil fuels and things like that. And obviously fake solutions is another big one as well, talking about, you know, the likes of algae and energy. And yeah, so obviously the analogy was already made around the tobacco industry and how this can be so effective. Like we have the case studies there to show not only the power of marketing and advertising and upholding something, but actually the power in taking it away. And there was a more recent example in the UK where there was like this junk food advert ban. So again, like focusing in on this healthy message that Martine was talking about. So this was quite recent in 2018, and actually the data now is showing that it's actually been really effective in terms of reducing the purchases of unhealthy foods and actually saving the health system a lot of money. And interestingly, you know, from an industry perspective, this policy also didn't show any decline in ad spend. So people, for example, companies can say they didn't have to let anybody go as a result of this policy, that it actually still helped, you know, maintain business, which is obviously a very powerful argument when it comes to talking to people within the industry and how we can actually, look at that just transition piece too for, young creatives and where their jobs can go. And obviously we need to do the same for fossil fuels. And beyond, I guess, the kind of movement building and pledges, there's a lot of creativity that goes into the campaigns of clean creatives. So there's the F-List Awards where they award people, lifetime achievement award for shortening lifetimes and things like that. So there's a lot of kind of how do we bring the skills of the industry to life to show how they can be used, I guess, in ways that bring attention to this issue in new ways. There's a brilliant page on Ad Net Zero, and Ad Net Zero is, I guess, the industry's response to the climate crisis in terms of creating a roadmap for agencies to decarbonize, but they didn't actually include a recommendation on fossil fuel clients in that plan. And so Clean Creatives actually took the online, the social media handles for Ad Net Zero and kind of co-opted them to draw attention to this gap in terms of not acknowledging the need for shifting away from fossil fuel clients. There's also been a very big one recently in terms of agencies who've signed this Clean Creatives Pledge who are also B Corps to come together to get B Corp to review agencies who are B Corps and do still maintain fossil fuel clients. So there was a recent big one called Havas, and their B Corp certification was taken away there last week. As a result of, I guess, this activism from within the industry to kind of say, if we're going to maintain the status of B Corp being something that is, positive for the environment or a positive business movement, it needs to kind of have that legitimacy there when it comes to fossil fuels. So that's kind of the whistle-stop tour of what's going on with Clean Creatives. And then in terms of purpose disruptors, it started in a pub. So this kind of really is this kind of real life community building. And we started off, as I said earlier, wanting to have a conversation about being concerned citizens who also worked in the marketing and advertising industry. So not only kind of about what needs to happen, but how we felt about it and just trying to connect with other people. And I guess that led to then hosting larger discussions and bringing the climate crisis to the fore in industry leadership conversations, getting people trained up in climate science and having those, I guess, really big moments for the industry. And this was in the UK. Then by 2021, we launched a film at COP26. It was the first ever documentary about advertising in its relationship with the climate crisis. And I guess that was, again, looking at the role of advertising, media, marketing, PR more critically, again, on that global stage. And then in 2023, we did an advertising summit at the Tate in Britain, getting people to kind of hear from experts in broader culture and academia to help inspire new thinking. So I guess, there's been this wave of acknowledgement of the problem, but this kind of sense of what is the belief that we have in terms of really changing mindsets and catalyzing this process to reevaluate the work for the greater good of people and planet. So I guess the story with Purpose Disruptors is it's ongoing, but it's that we work with agencies, media owners and media houses who are leading, I guess, in this conversation in the industry, and who I guess are working, a lot of these agencies, some would have fossil fuel clients. So how do you engage the leaders in those agencies in new ways? And then in Ireland, more specifically, I know I've only got about 2 minutes left, so I'll be really quick. I guess I'll focus in on the government consultation. So we were invited to make a statement on the role of advertising in the context of climate action in 2022, where we spoke about our measurement piece in the UK called Advertised Emissions, which essentially was talking about how the more ads you see, the more CO2 you create. And this is true not just of fossil fuel clients, which are obviously the heaviest emitters in terms of advertised emissions, but of other advertisements too. So it's about actually, as an industry, we need to start taking responsibility, not just about, you know, the emissions of our buildings or of the production it takes to make an ad, but actually the result of that creative work going out into the world, which is actually quite a new concept for people to get their heads around. So what is actually the impact of your SUV campaign and the result of those 100,000 new cars that you've claimed to have effectively sold? And we found in the UK in 2022 that advertising was responsible for adding an extra 32% onto every individual's carbon footprint in the UK. So if you're interested in that, definitely go and check out the advertised emissions report. But I guess the idea is that, yes, we need to reduce the spends then on these red brands, on these fossil fuel or these high carbon clients or briefs. And increase spend on the green ones. So where does all of that energy, that creativity go, that effectiveness that we know that we can have, I guess, is kind of the other side of the coin, right? If we're not taking on fossil fuel clients, where is the opportunity here to use all of these really clever, really smart, really strategic minds in new ways? And I guess that's kind of the question that we're coming to. These are the bills that are currently, you know, that was a coverage in 2022 of the Oireachtas committee that we were part of. And 2024, we've seen a few bills come out in terms of prohibiting fossil fuel advertising. These are still at very early stages, but good to see kind of politicians take it on. Obviously, I just wanted to talk about this in terms of ad bans that you know, cities are not looking at it just from the perspective of fossil fuel. They're looking at high carbon as well. So there's cities that have, you know, banned airline, SUV, but also looking at red meat and things like that. So yeah, just very quickly, I'll be 2 seconds, the opportunity beyond fossil fuel, I guess, is looking at advertising, right, as I said, like as one of as the creator of our cultural infrastructure, right? So we need to think about, I guess, our value systems and how they are impacted. And we all know that storytelling is so powerful, but, you know, not looking at advertising as a vertical, like the way we look at industries like fashion or retail, but to actually look at it, you know, as this industry that can actually really help accelerate what we want to happen or what needs to happen. And I guess uniquely what we have here is people who are really good at helping us to imagine differently, people who are really good at like creating new worlds out of thin air. And we are, in this sense, you know, a lot of academics talk about this imaginary crisis, that, you know, that we can more easily imagine the things that we don't want than the things that we really do want. And I think marketing and advertising can really help with that. But we haven't been imaginative. We've talked about greenwashing. We've talked about all these terrible things that we're doing. But we have this ability to really think differently. And I think when we talk about, you know, banning on fossil fuel advertising and reducing all of that, I think it's really important to also think about, well, what would be transformative? Like, how could we use this industry in a really transformative way instead, you know, at scale and at speed? Like, what would help us? Because we're architects of desire. You know, the work is everywhere. And, you know, there are 3,000 potentially suggestions every day for how life might be better. But the story that we tell is one of more. You know, again, you have the fossil fuel piece or the airline pieces there, but like it's also about I guess this lifestyle of wealth, of status, of power, and material abundance. Yeah, consumerism really, and that is, you know, the good life. So how do we change that story, I think, is the kind of question I will just leave you on. How could this cultural idea of the good life be different? And that's our creative pillar and purpose disruptors. So it's all around what people really dream about. We've engaged loads of different agencies and creatives on this question, and it really is about looking at shifting mindsets through the thing that we're really good at. While the other activism work happens, I think we need to do too. So this is just one example of an ad campaign, which was all around getting people to think about what really matters to them using the techniques of advertising. So you've all heard the have a break, have a Kit Kat. This is have a break, have a walk in the country. Again, interrupting advertisements that you'd normally see to invite people to reflect on what matters to them. You know, deal of the day, 50% more time with the family. So using that language in new ways. And we're doing just a Good Life 2030 campaign here in Ireland now, funded by the Irish government through Creative Ireland. So stay tuned for that. But it's just one way that we're hoping to, I guess, drive this conversation forward. So yeah, as Clean Creatives would say, the future of creativity is clean, and from the good life, the future is ours to create.
Thank you very, very much, Laura, and thank you to all of our speakers. Those are some really interesting, insightful contributions. We have a lot of questions that have come in over the course of the presentations, which is great. I know some of them have been answered already, but for some of the more like some of the ones that I think are a bit more interesting and I think maybe more common questions people might have, I might ask that the people that answer them also do it on the webinar now, because not everyone may have seen the text, and also for people who are watching back this recording for their benefit, if that's okay. So there's one that came in near the start, which was directed towards, I think primarily yourself, Jerry, because you made the claim that we need to stop burning things. And I was just asking for clarification, is that fossil fuels, or how does hydrogen play into that as well? I know it's a whole other can of worms, but maybe just for a little bit of information for people about hydrogen.
I think, Aaron, you're being very conscientious at this very late hour. If my brain still functions, basically, yes, I was mainly getting at hydrocarbons. There are certain other fuels that may potentially, in very small, specific circumstances, play a role, but there are major risks, and we would specifically be focusing on maybe green hydrogen, or what's called green hydrogen, as playing some role. But there are many other issues around use of other fuels that we have to be very wary of, including greenwashing.
Cool, thank you. There's like a couple questions there on aviation, which I think is probably one of the more maybe controversial issues, or one of the issues that we can like dig into a little bit more, because I feel most people on this call probably agree fossil fuel advertising is bad, but there's also, I think, maybe some deeper questions about aviation and what a just transition looks like that I might feel to people now, and then there's some other ones on advertising we can launch into. But there was one here, or there's two here that I'm just kind of combine and see if Hannah and Lounes, you're interested in taking them together. One being the fact that Ireland is an island, so would aviation restrictions impact industry or business in a way here that they might not happen in other countries where they have high-speed rail connections to other parts of the continent? And there was also a question about the cost of airline tickets. You know, if there are taxes other transport fuels are, and if there's a levy, some kind of carbon tax for the climate damage they cause, how would that impact tickets? Would that, disproportionately affect maybe people on lower incomes who want to avail of a holiday once a year and fly to Spain or something like that? How do we address that or counter that kind of line of thinking? So is that okay? Cool. So who wants to take that, Lounes or Hannah? Hannah.
Yeah, I can start, and if Lounes has further thoughts, can jump in or add at the end. I will start with the question about Ireland being an island, because I think that's, really interesting point. And I think that's like part of the reason that we're a network, and part of the reason that we work both globally and locally, because these solutions are always going to be context specific, and there is no kind of one size fits all solution to all contexts. So that's why we work with groups that are campaigning for a solution that works locally, and also linking together so they can share thoughts and things. I think it's important to recognize that with the climate crisis, businesses and industry will be disrupted, and we have to address that with a just transition. And so what we're doing is all about saying, okay, these things are going to be impacted, and how can we address them as early as possible so that workers, local communities have the least impact. And I think the third thing on this is that part of the reason that, or part of the thing that we talked about with the subsidies, is that the aviation industry gets so many subsidies and such a privileged position, which really takes money away from transport, which is more accessible for everyone. So if the aviation industry wasn't getting these subsidies, I think there, and what we need alongside the changes that we're calling for is also this investment in alternative modes of transport that do still make these things possible on islands, that open up, I don't know, but if better ferry connections, things that can be decarbonized slightly more easily. But I appreciate it's difficult because, you know, like there are a lot of issues obviously with shipping and things that make it also a big issue to address. And I think also, like, there is sometimes a bit of a misconception from the aviation industry that that when we talk about flying, we're prioritizing business, we're prioritizing industry, and actually, like, we see that, like, peak times are often holidays. It's not, you know, like we've seen through the pandemic how people can work remotely, and actually it's about rethinking our mindsets and having those conversations about how we can do that effectively. Lounes, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that.
Yeah, I think it was pretty complete. Not a lot to add. I think on the question of Ireland being an island, I think one catchphrase that we use a lot in Stay Grounded is that, like, reduction is going to happen whether by catastrophe or by design, and let's choose collectively design and anticipate the consequences it's going to have on economies and on local contexts. We are working in a lot of different islands, and a lot of islands that are isolated and very tourism dependent, where the question of even thinking aviation reduction is going to have like huge impacts on economies, like in Barbuda's islands or other contexts like this, where of course we need to think an economical transition alongside with like a reduction of consumption and tourism and mass tourism and aviation in general. It's not something we are like just completely ignoring, and that's what I try to also answer directly in the chat. On the second question of trying to put fairness in the way we reduce aviation, that's exactly why we are trying as Stay Grounded to push and demand and implement things like a ban on private jets, on super rich, super frequent flyers, so a ban on frequent flyer programs. That is like super important. It shouldn't be normal that the more you fly, the less you pay. It should be the opposite. So we are also trying to implement a frequent flyer levy at the European scale, and we did a big study on the feasibility and the means of implementation of taxing more and more the more you fly, the more you pay with a frequent flyer levy, instead of just thinking the reduction of demand with having like a kerosene tax and a ticket tax and all of the things that are since like the aviation industry is not a fair player, it's gonna lead to like an increase on the ticket prices and mainly affecting people that are taking one flight a year or less, which are like a majority of people, but a minority of the flight of the aviation aviation emissions. Sorry, and that's not our priority target, even if ideally, even the people and to meet our climate goals, the people traveling once a year should also reduce the amount of flights they are taking, but they are definitely not a priority.
Thanks, folks. That's really useful. The questions are, as is usual, the questions start to fly in the closer you get to the end point. So we're going to have to be quite selective in the ones that we bring forward. There was one there that I might address to both Martine and Laura, which was about the role of the advertising industry and, like, say, the work of groups like Clean Creatives. Is the risk there that big spenders, if you're encouraging them, not to work with like fossil fuel organizations is the risk that big spenders will take their accounts to less scrupulous agencies and then leave you guys shortchanged. So what's kind of the what's the answer there in terms of how you're supposed to interact with the idea that business will always go elsewhere? Either of you, Laura?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is a dilemma. I think there's always potentially another company that might take the business, and a lot of these accounts are very big accounts. But what's really interesting now is, I guess, that social license piece, or even just like the industry awareness piece. Like there can be no new tender for a fossil fuel client that is not now like widely known by everybody, and the agencies tendering for it being called out. And I think it's just becoming more and more like on that kind of blacklist list in terms of like being seen as like the worst of the controversial industries that you could be working for. And so that is going to have an effect in terms of, being able to hire people to work on these accounts, and, being listed on publicly by the F-List Awards in terms of like, even if you're not transparent about it, there are now a lot of people working to ensure there's transparency in the industry. So I think, we're always making choices as agencies in terms of like what type of business that we're going to work with. And this is like a proactive choice that more and more agencies are just making now in order to be able to keep other clients, because you'll use other clients if you just start to position yourself as an agency that doesn't have any moral compass whatsoever. I think those kind of Mad Men days are a bit behind us now, hopefully for the majority anyway. But it is hard because they're so lucrative, these accounts. Sorry, Jerry.
No, it's okay. I think it's a very valid point. We're operating in a capitalist economy where, money dictates what things get done. So I think it's a very fair point about how do you maintain a livelihood while also trying to fight the good fight in your industry.
Well, that's also why Clean Creative says it's like, don't go for any new accounts and make a plan for how you can stop working for your current clients. And, that is also about that vision for who do we want to work with? Who do we want our creative talent to be going towards? Like, what's the legacy we want to have here?
Yeah. Jerry, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just really quick, Laura, your presentation was absolutely superb. But the point that also struck me when you were speaking just there is that it's not only the positive development of advertising agencies refusing to, work with fossil fuel companies. It's also the need for them to decide not to work with some of the worst industries or most polluting industries or most polluting businesses, which Stay Grounded and Reclaim Fossil Free have talked about. It's also within individual sectors, maybe the need for companies to refuse to work with certain companies, which is a whole other topic of conversation, but related.
Yeah. We're running a little bit low on time, and I'm conscious that Martine, I haven't brought you in yet, but here's a question that maybe ties together the different strands, and hopefully we can finish up on, which is that, even more pernicious than standalone ads, Ryanair in Ireland sponsor programs on a national radio station, and this includes sponsorship of the weather reports. How can this level of embeddedness be challenged? So with, your experience in fossil-free advertising in the Netherlands, what are some kind of effective tactics or strategies we can use to challenge that level of influence that exists?
Yeah, good question. So we do use, for example, so I explained also about the watchdog that there is. So if there's any advertising that is misleading, you can go to the watchdog. And even though we don't believe that this is actually a good system, it can still help you to get your campaign in the media and to have a good example that actually that what we have doesn't exist, like what we need doesn't exist yet. But it's for this specific example. So this is an example that Ryanair goes on the radio. Sorry, I missed that a little bit. What was happening?
Yeah, they sponsor like national radio station broadcasts, like the weather report is sponsored by Ryanair. So they have a lot of power and influence in many different ways. So like, how do you begin to tear that apart?
Yeah. So we did that with one newspaper. We started with Trouw. And for example, with a newspaper, you can also have like opinion papers in a newspaper. So sometimes when there was like a fossil ad in a newspaper, we would put in that same newspaper an opinion piece about that ad, for example. You could also do that in the radio. So maybe you can even like buy up ad space collectively and make an ad against the ad that is there or against the sponsorship. And yeah, just really like do also work together with the people from inside the radio. So most of the time, people don't like, maybe there are people working for the radio that don't even know that it's sponsored by Ryanair, or they don't really talk about it. But there's always some people that don't really feel good about it, but they just need like a structure to organize themselves and make sure that they feel that there are a lot of people so that their job is protected, that they're not the only one who are speaking up. So we do have plans for next year also to really focus on news outlets and also on TV here, and really like work together with some bigger voices of presenters who present themselves, who maybe are presenters for the radio, and they present themselves as being part of the change, but then they still work for this fossil sponsored radio. So you can really like use these influential voices to be part of you and start a campaign with them.
Okay. And with that, I think I'm going to have to thank everyone who presented. I really appreciate you giving up your time on a Monday evening. It sounds like people really enjoyed your presentations as well. So thank you everyone for coming too. Just some final like last bits of housekeeping before we wind up for the evening. So these events, like I said, are made possible thanks to the funding of Irish Aid. And in order to keep running these events, we need your feedback. So how you found the events and how confident you feel to engage on these topics and take further action on these topics is an essential part of the process that we need to basically improve these events and make sure we have the capacity to keep running them. So I have just put in the chat there a link on Typeform, which is our what's the word? My brain has stopped working. Your feedback form. And I'm also going to share my screen with a QR code if you want to open it on your phone and do it there. It takes 2 minutes. So you can scan that QR code, and also that will pull up the form. So I'm just going to give you a few minutes to do that. And as you do that, I'm also, because we're short on time, just going to explain the next steps of what comes after this. So obviously we have, as Jerry outlined, work that we do as part as Friends of the Earth in terms of challenging fossil fuel influence, challenging new infrastructure going in. And one of the organizations that we are partnered with currently is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a campaign to get governments to agree to negotiate on a phase out of fossil fuels on a unilateral basis, similar to how there has been campaigns for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation of like nuclear weapons. We are having a follow-up meeting to this next week, so Monday, the 29th of July, also on Zoom, and it's going to be more of an interactive workshop where we look at the fossil fuel non-proliferation campaign in Ireland so far and globally, but looking at what the successes have been in Ireland. So a number of councils in Ireland have passed motions regarding the treaty, encouraging the government to work on the treaty, and we're going to look at where those have been successful, what was done, and what can we do now that that's happened? How can we hold those councils and national government to account? What does that mean? Like, can we use that as a lever to do things like, you know, banning fossil fuel advertising in certain spaces, getting the council to not accept contracts with certain companies that are deeply wedded to fossil fuels and this sort of thing? And also looking at where there might be opportunities to get more national momentum around it by looking at other places, other councils, other areas that have not had some of these motions passed, but where we might have sympathetic counselors or academics or whatever that might be interested in pushing for a similar initiative. So you are very, very welcome to that. I will be sharing the link for the Zoom or the registration form for the Zoom. We'll be going out to emails much like your registration for this event. So please keep an eye on your emails. And I will be following up with people directly after this with the reading, watching, listening list and the recording of this event and so on. So I think that's basically it. Has anyone got any final thoughts before we wrap up for the evening? Thank you, everyone. But yes, please fill out the form. So please fill out the feedback form. It really, really helps. Sarah, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say thank you so much. I think there's about 10 people who've already filled that out for us. It took less than 2 minutes for everyone. So if you could contribute to that, that would be a huge help. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I said this would finish at 8:30 sharp, so let's wind up. Sorry, Lounes, did you want to come in? Or?
No, so thanking you for this great presentation and this great webinar. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening, and let's continue to work on this and push back on fossil fuel influence. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Darren.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks all.